have entered a fascinating, a most relevant section of Judges that begins with our study of Gideon and then moves on into the aftermath of his era as a judge when one of his sons assumes a leadership position. Now, the lessons contained here provide that while on the one hand we must always understand the meaning of the Bible within the context of its own culture and time, on the other hand, we must also see that because God sets down immutable patterns that make human behavior predictable, unchanging, human history is invariably cyclical. It's repetitive. And like a clock, mankind progresses in a foreseeable way. It moves step by step from one stage to the next, yet the stages have been visited countless times before in exactly the same order. And it will continue that way until the Lord intervenes in the not distant future to end that cycle. The time of the Judges represents an era of downward spiral of Israel's faithfulness towards God, of mankind's declining morality. That era would end with the coming of a king sent by God to bring a new order of government to Israel and the better establishment of God's kingdom on earth. The era of the Judges was 11 o'clock on the timepiece of historical cycles. And we find ourselves today at that same hour, perhaps just a few seconds from midnight. We stand here in 2018 on our planet's crumbling foundation of confusion and fear and greed and selfishness and immorality at the precipice of immense change that is just one tick of the cosmic clock away. That the world doesn't see it is completely understandable. That much of God's church is oblivious to it is inexcusable. We moved into chapter 8 last week. We're going to finish it up this week. And read of Gideon having completed the first phase of the campaign to rid the land of the Midianite and Amalekite invaders who always came at harvest time to plunder Israel's food supply. Now, these nomadic locusts didn't come because they necessarily hated Israel. They came because they wanted what Israel had. They came because nomads don't know how to produce what they want and what they need. They only know how to pilfer it. Chapter 8 opened with the tribal leaders of Ephraim, the most powerful of the 12 tribes, coming to Gideon complaining they were not given deference in Gideon's plans and actions. And they feign ignorance and insult because they weren't included in the battle strategy. But in reality, they simply wanted credit. They wanted what they considered to be their right to some large amount of the spoils of war that had been collected. Ephraim knew full well what was going on. They just wanted to stand on the sidelines and wait for the dust to settle so that they could best position themselves for whatever outcome there might be according to whoever might be the victor. The warrior leader Gideon found himself forced into being a diplomat and kowtowing to the arrogant Ephraimite leadership in order to avoid the very real danger of inadvertently igniting intertribal warfare and so further dividing the Israelites instead of unifying them, at least to some degree. And as we continue now reading in Judges chapter 8, keep in mind a very important geopolitical dynamic about Israel and the promised land at this time. It has already essentially divided itself into a number of loyalties. Judah formed the basis for a coalition of tribes living in the southern part of Canaan. Ephraim formed the basis for a coalition of tribes living in the northern part of Canaan. And this is in addition to the obvious split between the tribes occupying the land on the east side of the Jordan River and the tribes occupying the land on the west bank of the Jordan River. And despite the north, south, east, west coalitions, each of the 12 tribes, first and foremost, sought to improve their own position and standing. So open your Bibles now to Judges chapter 8. Judges chapter 8, we're going to start reading at verse 10. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 280. Page 280. Judges chapter 8, beginning at verse 10. Now Zebach and Zalmunna were in Karkor with their army, about 15,000 men, all that remained of the entire army of the people from the east, since 120,000 arms-bearing soldiers had fallen. Gideon went up using the route of the nomads east of Novach and Yogbeha, and struck down the army when they thought they were safe. Zebach and Zalmunna fled, but Gideon pursued them. So he captured the two kings of Midian, Zebach and Zalmunna, and routed their whole army in panic. Now when Gideon the son of Joash returned from the battle by way of the Heres Pass, he captured a young man from Sukkot and asked him about the chiefs and leaders of Sukkot, and he wrote down for him the names of 77 of them. Then he came to the people of Sukkot and said, "You insulted me when you said, 'You haven't captured Zebach and Zalmunna yet, so why should we give you bread for your exhausted men?' Well, here are Zebach and Zalmunna." And he took the leaders of the city and desert thorns and thistles and used them to teach the people of Sukkot a lesson. He also broke down the tower of Penuel and put the men of the city to death. And then he said to Zebach and Zalmunna, "Tell me about the men you killed at Tabor." And they answered, "They looked like you, like a king's sons." And Gideon replied, "They were my brothers, my mother's sons. And as surely as Adonai is alive, I swear that if you had spared them, I wouldn't kill you." Then he ordered his oldest son, Yeter, "Get up, kill them." But the boy didn't draw his sword. Still being a boy, he was afraid. Then Zebach and Zalmunna said, "You do it. You kill us. Let a grown man do what takes a grown man's strength." So Gideon got up and he killed Zebach and Zalmunna, and then he took the ornamental crescents from around their camels' necks. The men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son and your grandson, because you saved us from the power of Midian." And Gideon replied, "Neither I nor my son will rule over you. Adonai will rule over you." And then he added, "But I have this request to make of you, that each of you would give me the earrings from the booty you've taken." For the enemy soldiers had worn gold earrings, like all the other tribes descended from Ishmael. And they replied, "We're glad to give them to you." And they spread out a robe, and each man threw in the earrings from his booty. The gold earrings he requested weighed more than 42 pounds, and this doesn't include the crescents, pendants, and purple cloth worn by the kings of Midian and the chains around their camels' necks. Out of these things, Gideon made a ritual vest, which he located in his city, Ophrah. But all Israel turned it into an idol there, and thus it became a snare to Gideon and his family. This is how Midian was defeated by Israel, so that they ceased to be a threat. The land had rest for 40 years during the lifetime of Gideon. Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, returned to his home and stayed there. Gideon became the father of 70 sons because he had many wives. He also had a concubine in Shechem. She too bore him a son whom he called Avimelech. Gideon, the son of Joash, died at a ripe old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Avi Esri. But as soon as Gideon was dead, the people of Israel again went astray after the Baals and made Baal Brit their god. They forgot Adonai their God, who had saved them from the power of all their enemies on every side. They showed no kindness towards the family of Zerubbabel, that is, Gideon, to pay for them all the good he had done for Israel. Well, Gideon and his 300 were in hot pursuit of this remnant of the Midianite, Amalekite band of marauders. But he finally caught up to them at a place called Karkor. Now we need to get our bearings and kind of remember that Gideon was now operating on the east side of the Jordan River. There remained about 15,000 enemy soldiers, which is still a sizable number for a mere 300 Israelite troops to take on. But Gideon and his men were properly confident that with Jehovah on their side, the outcome was already decided. And their rout of that 135,000 in the valley of Jezreel made what was about to come seem like certain victory. Well, the valley of the nomads from the valley of Jezreel were apparently, who escaped from the valley of Jezreel, were apparently completely unprepared for Gideon's band of brothers to follow them to what must have been considered by them to be a safe zone. Well, the invaders' army was further reduced, and then Zevach and Zalmunna, the two Midianite leaders, were captured. Now, it's interesting to note that up to this point in the Bible, the Midianites were prominently mentioned and painted as a formidable nation. But from here on, there is scant mention of them. So it seems that Gideon's determination to end the Midianite threat once and for all had its desired effect. Now, beginning in verse 13, we find out why Gideon delayed executing Zevach and Zalmunna. He wanted to use them as an object lesson for his eldest son, and he wanted to demonstrate to the people of the villages of Succoth and Penuel that they should never have doubted him. They should have helped him. So he took these two Midianite leaders with him on his way back home. He stopped at Succoth to carry out the vengeance that he had promised. When those townspeople refused to offer customary and expected hospitality and rest for his 300 men. Now remember, the people of Succoth were brother Hebrews. So just as he had promised days earlier, he used thorns and thistles to tear the flesh from the bodies of the leaders of Succoth to teach them a lesson. And then moved on to Penuel, and he tore down their watchtower and also put several of the city's leading men to death. Well, why such a harsh reaction by Gideon? Well, the decision of the people of Succoth and Penuel in refusing to aid their fellow Israelite Gideon was a great sin against God. They had refused to help a servant of Jehovah who had been anointed as a shofet, as a judge, to carry out the holy war that God had assigned him to fight. And rather than fulfill both the letter and the spirit of the promise made to Moses nearly 200 years earlier, to always stand with their brethren who took up the challenge of entering the promised land, led by Joshua, these members of the 2.5 tribes of the Transjordan decided to look out only for themselves. Now, they ought to have been more than willing to see the great mutual benefit of eradicating, or at least diminishing, Midian and Amalek. Instead, they were fearful of reprisals by these nomads if Gideon failed. They were simply not willing to believe that the same God who gave Gideon and his 300 men victory over 135,000 would give Gideon victory over the remaining 15,000. Their unbelief cost them great pain, a loss of an important piece of their infrastructure, their watchtower, and for many of them, their mortal lives. Now, the people of Succoth and Penuel had been given a choice by Gideon: stand with Israel and God, or stand with the enemy. It's an amazing thing that with all the admonitions in the Bible that to not stand with God and his people is the same as rebelling against him, that many large Christian denominations as well as our USA government, has at times chosen to behave as the citizens of Sukkot. Neutrality is not a legitimate option in spiritual matters. Even-handedness is not an option when it comes to God's people. You can't be an aid both to God's people and to the enemies of God's people. Only politicians and wrong-minded religious leaders can plead for tolerance of the oppressors of God's chosen as a godly thing to do. Gideon was God's earthly hand of wrath against those who chose to rebel against the Lord's will. Now, before we move on to the execution of the two Midianite leaders, I want to pause briefly to speak about a couple of other vital God principles that are at play here. Recall that I've mentioned on numerous occasions that it is the Torah that develops the divine principles by which men are to live and abide if they want to be in harmony with God. What follows the Torah relies on those principles. And thus we are going to see those principles played out, either in a negative or a positive fashion, in the remainder of the Bible. The punishment for the men of Sukkot and Penuel was a demonstration of what happens when a violation of Torah principles occurs. I want to talk for a minute about the value of persistence, because it is something that we are all faced with on a nearly daily basis. Gideon is one of the finest examples in the Tanakh of persistence in service to the Lord. Gideon had achieved a resounding and major victory over Midian and Amalek in the valley of Jezreel, and most reasonable men would have stopped right there. In fact, stopping the fighting upon the majority of military objectives being obtained was the hallmark of Joshua and of those Israelite leaders who followed him. As great as Joshua was, as venerated as he remains in the eyes of Holy Scripture and of the Hebrews, Joshua did not finish the job. His task wasn't just to win some major battles. It was to eradicate an evil enemy. The reason that Israel is under the enormous pressure from all sides like it is today is because Joshua and those who followed him lacked any persistence. The people who hate Israel, who vow to wipe it off the map, are the descendants of the people who ought to not even exist. They're the descendants of the people that God ordered Israel to annihilate, but they didn't. Gideon did what all the earlier and the later leaders of Israel were supposed to do: not stop until the holy war was complete. Therefore, Gideon followed the mere 8% of the Midianite army that remained for a distance of 150 miles on foot in order to confront them and wipe them out. The problem of finding food for his men was ever present. Even the two Israelite cities in the Transjordan that could and should have helped him refused. I mean, how discouraging that must have been. But Gideon pressed on, and he refused to cave in. So the Midianites, from that time on, ceased to be a problem for Israel. What we find is that the largest source of Gideon's discouragement was not the enemy. It was those who ought to have been his friends and allies. His own brethren were so interested in maintaining a comfortable lifestyle and not rocking the boat and assuring that they suffered no inconvenience that they preferred coexistence with the enemy rather than keeping a tight bond with their own people and with God. The people of Sukkot and Penuel weren't asked and to go and fight alongside Gideon, only to help provision them, and really in some respects to just not stand in the way. First, it was the Ephraimites who approached Gideon immediately following his battle with their complaining, and they effectively hindered him from doing his job in order to suffer their self-centered and egotistical demands. Then it was the townspeople of those 2 Israelite cities in the Transjordan who denied cooperation and support when he was on his way to finish off the enemy. I mean, what might you or I have done in Gideon's place? Would we have had the sheer guts, the unshakable faith, the iron will to continue to fight the good fight, even though the very people we're fighting for tries to block our way at every turn? Gideon could have easily seen this opposition from his own people as a sign to just quit and turn back. Why should he put himself and his loyal men at such risk for the sakes of people who wouldn't even give them so much as a loaf of bread? Loved ones, this is a very sharp warning for us. It is Israel who stands on the front lines. 6 million Jews surrounded by 200 million Arabs who want to take what is rightfully Israel's. 1 billion Muslims stand with their Arab brothers and threaten all who wish to stand with Israel. Give us Israel, they say, and the reason for their jihad will end. Stand with Israel, and you just might suffer. You and I are at such relatively small risk compared to those brave and dedicated Jews who risk it all to live in the Holy Land that God gave to Jacob's descendants and to defend it and to prepare the way for the return of the Messiah, even though they don't even know they're doing it. We are as the people of Succoth and Penuel. We are quite literally Israel's brothers who need to willfully stand with them and help them in every way. But instead, Americans tend to complain, refuse to help them beyond a pittance, and then we carefully position ourselves, no matter what happens to Israel, we're covered. See, we're not being asked to strap on battle gear, go fight for them. We're merely being asked to aid them with our money and support and unconditional love. We're being asked to not give their enemies more armaments, more food, more land, more political cover. But for the vast majority of the world, and frankly for far too many Christians, and sadly for a huge portion of Jews that live outside of the Holy Land, we don't want to be involved. And I can confidently assure you that in time God's vengeance will be manifest on those who behave as the citizens and leaders of Succoth and Penuel did 3,300 years ago. Maybe the current worldwide financial meltdown, the one we had just a few years ago, one we're really not even all the way out of yet, is but a taste of what those who oppose the Lord and side with his enemies will face as a consequence. And I will just say, as Christ said a few times, may he who has ears to listen hear. Well, in verse 18, Gideon determines it's time to bring Zevach and Zalmunna to justice. So Gideon prefaces this with an inquiry that basically allows these 2 leaders to indict themselves. He says, "Tell me about the men you killed at Tabor." This is speaking about Mount Tabor, and the people living there had no part in the battle. But this shows that not only did the Midianites plunder Israel, they also committed terrible acts among the Hebrew population simply to intimidate and control. Their answer was that these men they killed at Tabor looked an awful lot like Gideon. And Gideon tells them that there's a darn good reason for that. These men were his family, his siblings. They were, as the Bible said, my mother's sons. So they were direct blood relatives, not distant relatives. So Gideon says, if you had spared them, I wouldn't kill you now. Well, it was unusual to not kill captured kings and military leaders. I mean, it happened for sure, but the general custom was to respect their station and to allow them to live. Killing them served to dishearten the enemy, also served at times to arouse their anger. Gideon had a duty. His brothers were killed unjustly. So Gideon was compelled to be their next of kin avenger, their blood avenger. He instructed his firstborn son to execute Zabok and Zalmunna, but he was just too intimidated to do it. Yeter was still young. He wasn't accustomed to killing men, certainly not such fierce and hardened men that stood in front of him. So the two Midianite leaders, seeing the boy was not yet physically mature and was scared witless, then made a request of Gideon, you kill us. See, these were brave warriors. They didn't fear death. They wanted their execution to be swift, as painless as possible. And they knew Yeter was incapable of that. So Gideon granted them their request. Then verse 21 says something that is easily overlooked. It says, then he took the ornamental crescents from around their camels' necks. In other words, Gideon took as spoils of war these crescent-shaped pendants that hung around the necks of the camels that Zabok and Zalmunna owned and rode. The crescent is referring to the crescent moon. And verse 24 says that the reason that the enemy had crescents and certain other ornamentations on their camels and on their persons is that they were Ishmaelites. They were descendants of Ishmael. Now, what prominent modern group of people who claim an attachment to Ishmael employs the crescent moon as their symbol? Islam, Muslims. Now, before you jump to conclusions, let me explain. Islam did not exist in Bible times, not even in New Testament times. The founder of Islam, Muhammad, was born in the late 6th century AD. However, Islam is an odd mixture of Judeo-Christian principles with Arab folklore and with the ancient moon god religion of the Sabaeans. The symbol of the moon god is, and has always been throughout history, the crescent moon. But even the Sabaean religion doesn't go back to the time of the judges. That said, the worship of the moon god does go back even further than the time of Gideon to a time before Abraham. And it was even prevalent in the city of Ur, where Abraham's father, Terah, made and sold god idols. In fact, during Abraham's day, it appears as though Ur was the moon god center of the region. The point is that even as early as 1300 BC, it's the time of Gideon, the Arabs had already adopted many elements of moon god worship, and we find it right here in the Bible. All the symbols that ancient tribes wore were inherently religious in nature. Moon god worship changed form until today it is realized in the Muslim religion. Even the signaling of the time of Ramadan, the most holy season for Islam, is at the appearance of the crescent moon. By the way, isn't it interesting that Jehovah signals the start of his festivals at the appearance of what? What is it? the full moon. Just another proof that as some of Christianity's most visible leaders have started to proclaim and promote the mixing of Islam and Christianity into something being called Chrislam, for real, that Jehovah and Allah are in no way the same God, because they have inherently different characteristics and give different commandments. Now, interestingly, in modern times, Islam has become somewhat embarrassed at all of its moon god heritage, and so has taken to denying it as of late. In fact, a few decades ago, some of the Muslim sects began to remove the chapters in the Quran that spoke directly to it. Not all that long ago, there was a British man who wrote a book about this Islamic cover-up and named it the Satanic Verses. And this guy's name was Salman Rushdie. And some of the Islamic religious leaders ordered him killed for exposing this. He's been hiding in seclusion for years. Well, the so-called Satanic Verses are the verses removed from the Quran to hide the direct moon god beginnings of Islam, as forthrightly stated in their holy book. Now, of course, all of the Islamic crescent moon related symbols and rituals, the observances, all timed to the appearance of the crescent moon, even the name of their god, Allah, all refers directly to the moon god. So here we have in the book of Judges moon god worshippers, sons of Ishmael, bedeviling Israel over 3,000 years ago. God full well knew that the violent and murderous intent of Muslims to rid the world of all vestiges of God's people would do nothing but increase as a result of Israel's reluctance to deal with moon god worshiping Arabs and Midianites and other Middle Eastern tribes when they first began to occupy Canaan. I mean, I hope you see what I mean about the cyclical nature of history. The entire world is subject to it. The only real question before us is this the final cycle? Or is there another one to follow it? I mean, it's important to know, if we can know, because the final cycle will end with the return of Yeshua. Well, verse 22 reveals something startling, but expected. In fact, I suggested in their introduction to Joshua some time ago to watch for it. Recall that I told you that the purpose for the era of the judges was to convince Israel they must have a king to rule over them. It was God's intent that Israel had a king, but they didn't want one. They'd had enough of kings. The king of Egypt was the last king to rule over them, and that hadn't worked out very well. I want to be clear. Despite the prevalent and completely misguided teaching within Christianity that God did not want Israel to have a king, nothing could be further from the scriptural truth. It's only that God wanted Israel to have his king. A king who would be a godly king in the mold of a shepherd's servant, as opposed to the mold of a self-serving, power-seeking, wealth-driven, charismatic type of king that the world always seeks. The first God-approved and provided king would be David. The next God-approved king will be Yeshua when he returns to set up his kingdom. But after Gideon defeated the Midianites, some of the 12 tribes of Israel had been oppressed so many times, had gone through so many hardships, that they finally began to realize that they were not going to make it unless they banded together under a single leader. Therefore, some of the tribal and clan leaders went to Gideon and they offered him the job as king over them. Indeed, this was a pretty major turn of events. However, Gideon, even though he was deeply flawed, knew enough of God to refuse the offer. Gideon was an anointed shofet, not a melech, a king. So he told the people, the Jehovah, God, he's their king. There's no need for any other. Well, a couple of things to consider about the evolving society and attitudes of the Israelites. First is that there was this growing understanding that a more robust and continuing leadership was of a real benefit for the people. Second, coupled with that is that a judge was only raised up after there'd been a long period of subjugation. And when the judge delivered the people, that shofet, that judge, would rule until he died, and there would be no successor. So the leadership ended, and the next cycle of oppression would begin. Why? Because at that point, upon the death of that leader, Israel was leaderless. By accepting a government over them, based on a monarchy, there was a natural means of succession. The king's sons usually took over. Further, by that king actually being a head of a sovereign government, a standing army could be formed. And then the possibility of preventing another foreign subjugation would become realistic. People of all eras are very practical. And so there were real and pressing circumstances between the Israelite tribal and clan leaders' sudden willingness to cede their personal autonomy over to a king. I mean, are you able to bring this principle forward to today and see where the entire world, including the USA, is heading in that regard? We have watched within the last several years as the United States has all but nationalized our mortgage and lending institutions. Britain has overtly purchased majority shares in their nation's banks, making them de facto government-owned. But it happened as a practical matter. It was not an attempt at a coup. The prospect of a worldwide financial Armageddon is so real, so imminent, all the time, that these steps were deemed unavoidable by a bunch of panic-stricken politicians, billionaire business leaders, and even a majority of these nations' citizens want this. You know, it was years ago when Barack Obama went to Europe, and he was hailed as a world leader, almost a global messiah of sorts. I think you remember that. Even before that financial system meltdown. Folks, the world wants a king. It's our God-given nature. The Lord is driving the world towards a king. If I've heard it once, I've heard it 100 times on our financial TV channels, especially during that meltdown of a few years ago. But there's little choice but to quickly begin to integrate our money and credit markets into one worldwide system, because the pell-mell globalization of the last several decades has so entangled the world's corporations and governments that if we don't integrate them, there'll be no way to manage fiscal and monetary policy. You know, not long ago, for the first time in history, the United States and several other nations worked in concert with their various national banking systems to lower key interest rates precisely in lockstep. Think about that. Nations working together so that everybody lowered their interest rates, so that money would not flow from one nation to another nation in order to seek better terms. This is at least as big an event, a change in direction of the world, That's when some of the leaders of Israel asked Gideon to become the first king of Israel. It's a big deal. But we're just we go on blindly about this stuff. The world wants a king. And pretty soon we're going to anoint one. Christians know him as the Antichrist. God wants us to have a king, but it won't be the one we'll choose, the one that will betray us. God wants us to have his Son as our king, a perfect king, but we simply will not be ready for him, and the world will not accept him until we've experienced the final horror of a worldwide kingdom run by an evil man of our own choosing. As much merit as Gideon showed by not accepting the position of king, there is no doubt that the trappings of being a king intrigued and ultimately seduced him. Because in verse 24, he says that while he humbly refuses the offer of kingship, he'd kind of appreciate it if they'd offer him some tribute. Gideon asked that all who helped to fight, all who had received some of the spoils of war from the Midianites, would give to him all the gold earrings they had taken from the defeated enemy. The people complied and included also some of the crescents, pendants, and even some very valuable purple cloth that was worn by the kings and by royalty. So while Gideon may not have been a king, he would certainly live like one. But then Gideon took another step that is really troubling. He may have refused to be Israel's official king, but he obviously attempted to create a new alternative to the existing priesthood by making himself equivalent to the high priest. He took much of the roughly 50 pounds of gold and he made an ephod, a ritual vest worn by the high priest. And he used it, we're told, in his own hometown of Ophrah. I mentioned in earlier lessons that one of the reasons that Israel was constantly flirting with idolatry and then going through these cycles of apostasy, then punishment by God, then oppression as part of that punishment, then deliverance, then restoration, and then a nice long period of peace, is because the priesthood was not properly functioning. It was probably due to a combination of the people paying a little attention to them. The priests had no actual civil authority over the 12 tribes. The people were not giving the priesthood their tithes and their offerings, so that the priest had little choice but to go to work for a living. The priesthood then losing respect over their corruption. Well, the tabernacle at this point was located in Shiloh. So for Gideon to make for himself a high priest ritual vest and keep it in Ophrah demonstrates how far from any scriptural teaching Israel was now operating. Verse 27 that says that the people looked up to that ephod of Gideon as an idol. More accurately, it says they went whoring after it. But the point is that they accepted the ephod and its wearer as the real thing. Soon it became not a tool of God, but it became an object of worship. God had ordained one high priest only, but now Gideon, who had refused the civil role as a king, turned right around and created the spiritual, religious role of high priest for himself. Now, this sort of thing would be copied many years in the future when the Israelites of Samaria broke away from the Jerusalem-based priesthood and created their own separate and independent priesthood, even building their own temple that was in operation in Jesus' day. Despite all of Gideon's foibles, his delusions of grandeur, Midian was defeated. The northern tribes of Israel were delivered, and Gideon settled in as the judge over that area of Canaan. His office of judge would last for 40 years, and there would be peace and rest for God's people, at least those in the north of Canaan, all during that time. But to demonstrate Gideon's rather inflated view of himself, verse 30 explains he had 70 sons by as many wives. Having 70 wives takes a lot of wealth. Do you remember much earlier Gideon had explained to God that he couldn't possibly be a savior for Israel? Why? His clan was the poorest of all the clans of the tribe of Manasseh. Having many wives was also something decidedly looked down upon by God and was deemed acceptable only in Hebrew society if royalty produced such a harem. Then in the following verse is the setup for the next chapter. And we're introduced to a fellow named Abimelech. This man was Gideon's son by means of a concubine from the city of Shechem. That does not mean that Abimelech was illegitimate, but it does mean he automatically carried a lower status in his family than his brothers. Well, this chapter ends with Gideon's death. It says he lived to a ripe old age, meaning that he had received God's blessing of a full lifespan. But as soon as he died, Israel immediately started chasing after the Canaanite gods again. They went so far as to actually officially name Baal Brit, meaning Baal of the covenant, as their god. Good leadership is always essential in God's plan. But any human leader is subject to failure. Gideon wasn't any different. What he couldn't have known, though, is what his example was going to do to his family after his death. Avimelech means the father is king. It's a regal title. Avimelech is a title. It's not a name. In other words, this is not the formal name of this son of a concubine. Rather, it is a title given to him later on in life by Gideon, probably when this son was an adolescent. So we see Gideon's propensity to serve out his time as a judge in a very kingly manner. Now such a title is given to a son because the father has very high aspirations for him. And we're going to see in Judges chapter 9 that Avimelech fully embraced his father's aspirations. I want to end today with this note. It is absolutely astounding how fast a person, a family, an entire nation can forget God's blessings that made them who and what they are, and then just turn to idolatry. Israel could not resist that pull towards Baal because the people that lived among Israel were Canaanites who were permitted to continue worshiping Baal. This pagan mystery Babylon religion must have been awfully attractive to most Hebrews because it seems they just couldn't wait to get back to it. The minute a godly leader wasn't there to insist on their allegiance to Jehovah. Yet in all of this, one should not overlook the power of Satan to bring delusion. He had deluded the Israelite people in the first place to follow this false way. Now he was able, pretty easily, to do the same all over again, despite the awesome and unmistakable lessons that God had taught to Israel. One must not ever underestimate the power of the great and continuing enemy of God and of God's program of redemption. So we'll take up the story of Avimelech the next time we meet.